So yeah, I guess as a bit of context. So yeah, last week, as you'll know, we were in Milan and did some more brainstorming. We had kind of maybe 3.5 days because we also had to finalize the hierarchy paper, but that's now been submitted for re-review. So looking forward to getting those comments back. And yeah, it was maybe not the direction we expected, but basically we ended up revisiting a lot of kind of stuff around behavior and states, and it's still kind of a work in progress. So what you'll hear is, I guess, not like final, but basically these are some ideas for how we might take a step back about our assumptions around state and behavior, and you know, for example, state and morphology models, removing that and kind of having state on a more location by location basis. Um, these kinds of concepts, but yeah, but over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, and just a couple. Let me just paint the picture. Okay, so we're in Milan, which is a pretty city, but it's not a lot of touristy stuff there. So it's kind of like homogenous, and we had our three little Airbnbs near each other, and so we're trying to just localize between our three little Airbnbs. And Niels bought a fold up, roll up whiteboard, which is kind of fun. And the idea is, normally you would unroll it and glue it to a wall, but we didn't want to glue it to the wall, so he left the backing on it, right? So now what that meant is it didn't lie flat. It had these little ridges all over the place. So if we're using this whiteboard, you had to imagine, you saw some of the pictures, you have to you couldn't just write anywhere on the whiteboard. It was kind of fun. But it still worked. I'm just giving you a picture of what it was like if the three of us sat there arguing with each other for 8 hours and then come back and do it the next day. So I'm going to just switch to showing a few notes I put in Excalidraw, if I can do that. So I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. And let's see here. This one right here is what I want to share. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Everyone see that? Yes? I can't hear anyone.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
This is always a bit of a mystery here. Why is my screen looks a little weird? It's got some extra lines on it, which I never saw before. Okay, well, I'm not sure why it looks a little weird. So just I was hoping to do some real nice drawings, and we had some on our whiteboard, but I didn't do them. I didn't have time. I was focused on other things, and I was also confused. So this is not as nice as I'd like it to be. So we're just going to go through these ideas, and present them briefly, and we can have discussions about them if you want. I'm not going to get you into all the depth of our discussions, which are crazy. So it's really just a very high level sort of introduction to the things we talked about. So you can see here, my first here is that we did not discuss, as Neil said, whoops, I didn't want to do that. I wanted the marker. It's that K, I think it is, right? Yeah, there we go. We did not discuss any major new topics. We discussed details and issues related to behaviors, as Niels just said. We agreed upon some things. We didn't agree upon other things. So we didn't come out of this consensus on everything. And so I've broken it down to 4 topics here. That's a little bit arbitrary, but that's how I did it. And we can just some of this stuff may be the way you're thinking about it already, but we discovered that Niels, Vivian, and I didn't all think about these things the same way. So we spent a lot of time debating what we meant when we were thinking, what language meant, and so on. So I'm not saying you might kind of look at some of these and go, oh, that's new. You might say, oh yeah, that's the way I thought of it. Well, maybe. Number one, this is just, we settled on this idea that behaviors, think of behaviors as a child object to a parent, right? So you have a stapler and there's a behavior, some part of the stapler. But we're going to say it always has a paired child object. So I said a paired MOP model, meaning a paired child morphology model, and it always has a child behavior model. So you can see that in this picture over here. This is just a very abstract idea that here's a parent object, there's a parent morphology model up here, and associated with some areas on that, there's a child, and there's a child morphology model and a child behavioral model. So at one point we talked about the child morphology model and behavior model being the same column in the same learning module. And then a while back, we split them into 2. So this is still the idea that there's two. But there's always going to be a child morphology model. So when we talked about the stapler opening and closing, we said, oh, well, how we can make a prediction of the stapler? And we said, we'll have to maybe I'll have to create a child, object for the top. We're just going to say there's always a child object, and if you didn't have one, like some movement starts appearing someplace, you're going to form one instantly. So this is an assumption that we have now, that there's always these two that are paired together. And basically, the behavioral model here tells you two things. It tells you how the orientation and location of the child object is moving relative to the parent, and in a mechanism that Vivian had outlined and I couldn't reproduce, and Niels is prepared to reproduce today should we need it. This red arrow represents the idea that the behavior model itself doesn't know what the child object is. It could be applied to different child objects, right? It could be a staple opening or a laptop opening. So it sends a movement command over here, which essentially updates the location of the child object to the parent so that these two can make the right predictions. That's the basic idea that we had before. But we've just, the thing I'm pointing out right now is there's always a paired child behavior and morphology object. The behavior cannot exist independent of an associated child object. And there's always one of these. So like when Rami showed us the exploding logo, that wasn't a single behavior. That would have been multiple behaviors because there were individual childs moving separately. So like there were different parts of the logo moving in different directions. So that is not a single behavior. In fact, we couldn't learn it as a single behavior. We could follow one part of the exploding logo and see how it behaved, and we could follow another part of the exploding logo. So this idea that this child morphology object there's one thing that's being controlled by this behavioral model or being modeled by this behavioral model, and if a parent object has multiple independently moving pieces like the exploding logo, then you would have to have multiple behavior child pairings, and you'd have to learn them separately. So that's this first item here. I'll stop there, and people can ask any questions if they want to ask questions. It's going to get more complicated soon.
You said that like when the stapler top is moving, if we didn't have the child morphology object, it will be learned instantly.
Yeah.
Could you like elaborate on that? So I mean, the top is moving, and by definition, we're slow at learning.
Well, we are and we aren't, right? So I know this is not how it felt, but this is kind of like, we're going to try to make this work. So for example, there's a couple things going on there. One, if I just saw a stapler, I might have on my own learned that as a bunch of the top is a child object because it has its own separate physical space it occupies, we might have done that initially. However, what if this behavior starts surprisingly? Like I didn't even know there was going to be a hinge, or I didn't know it was a stapler, and so all of a sudden something starts moving. Well, you could. We're going to get to this in a moment, but the area of movement will be marked by a series of change bits, if you will. There's sort of the area of the top, all the edges of it are moving, and if you took that summation of those, you just took those things and say, I'm going to now create an object at that point. The object could be very simple. It could be say, hey, it's a rectangle, and I wouldn't be able to make very good predictions about it, but maybe I hadn't learned any of the details before. But I can immediately say, there's a child object here. Let's start building one in a very, we're going to assume it's there. Just like we're going to start building a child behavioral model instantly, we're going to build a child morphology model instantly. And we may have more or fewer details in that depending on what we've learned before. But it could be that you already, by the way the brain would work, it might have parsed out that top piece of the stapler because it's almost separate. But if it didn't, it would very quickly start and form a new one, and it would have more or fewer details. If this behavior started in some object where I had no expectation that something was going to hinge open, I might have a very impoverished model of that section, and I wouldn't be able to make good predictions. I would just say, hey, something. We use the example of a French fry. imagine you had the top of the staple as a French fry. Well, I recognize French fries, but I don't really a crinkly fry. But I don't usually recognize the details of the crinkly fry. So if all of a sudden I said, oh, imagine what the top of the staple is going to look like. I would know it's going to be a crinkly French fry, but I wouldn't know it had the details of the one that was a moment ago flying before. That is, my predictions would be pretty poor. But I would have said, yeah, it's a crinkly French fry. I'll predict a crinkly French fry. So that's an example we discussed. I don't know if that answers your question, Jose.
I guess just to also solidify, there's still no model copying or anything from the parent morphology object, because I assume the parent morphology, so I'm assuming the case where parent morphology has a full stapler, not learned separately, but if a part of it starts moving, like we don't get to transfer whatever is in the parent morphology as like the child morphology.
No, you don't get to transfer it. There's no transfer of knowledge. You might. We didn't spend a lot of time on this issue. It's more like we deduce that this must be the case, that you must have a child morphology object, and then we could come back later and deal with the details. So there's no copying, but we didn't work out those details. It could be that both the two regions already both have a model of stapler. So now you're just you're just isolating a section of the child object and saying the child is now a subset of the model it already had.
Right. I was just going to say that, one mechanism for kind of doing this that we talked about a while ago was, if the parent and the child regions both had the model for the stapler, there might be some mechanism to use attention to sort of temporarily create a model just to the head of the stapler in the child.
I think that's what's happening. In fact, the last couple of days I've been just deep diving on the idea of attention, because I think that's one of the next things we really have to get a grasp on.
Agree.
And we have a lot of good deep thoughts about it, and I was making progress on it, but I'm not ready to talk about it today. But yes, that is part of the solution. Yeah.
Rami,
hand it over to Rami.
Yeah, it's interesting, assuming that we always have a pair between a child behavior and a child morphology objects. I'm wondering if this connection here could actually help us narrow down the attention. If we're looking at a stapler and we detect that there's some behavior, we don't know what. We could be looking at the stapler and we detect the behavior based on motion patterns or something like that. Would the behavior child object help us figure out where the morphology is, or like narrow down our attention on the morphology, given that there's always this pairing between some morphology agnostic child behavior and a child morphology?
So you're assuming that we had a behavioral model already, that we learned it.
Yeah, we have a behavior model already, and we're basically just going to use that to figure out what the morphology. It's like we have all those three pieces: the parent morphology, child behavior, and child morphology. And if we can figure out two of those, can that help us figure out?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, clearly these things all have sort of an attentional window associated with them, and so the extent that I can extract sort of the size or the area of the behavior model, it would tell me the size and area of the child model, and where it is on the parent model and that kind of stuff. And so in my mind, these attentional windows are really going to be sort of some region in space that's defined by these changing bits. Right.
Yeah.
And the funny thing about your exploding logo, when the first time we saw it, you try to model it as a single behavior. And so you might see a whole bunch of moving bits and you say, okay, that's the thing that's changing. But then very quickly you realize that there's multiple movements inside of that thing. And one of the consequences of what I'm talking about here is that there's only one movement vector, right? The behavior model doesn't represent multiple movement vectors. It's at any point in time, the child can be doing this. And the next time it could be doing this, but it can't say, oh, part of the child's doing this and part of the child's doing that. That's the exploding logo, and it doesn't work. So that's why this red arrow here is really it's a simple movement vector.
But the idea that we first detected the behavior, and even from the exploding logo, we first detected that there is a child object that is moving in a specific way, in a specific direction with some motion field vectors. that led to the separation of the objects in the morphology. I'm saying that maybe we can detect the behavior first based on some primitive motion vectors, and then this would lead to the separation of the child morphology objects.
Maybe, right. The way I view it is our attention was drawn to where the changes were occurring, and that was everywhere at once. And then you quickly realize that you can't model that as a single thing. It's just as soon as you have two vectors, two movements in different directions, it tells you there are multiple things there. I mean, I think I'm saying the same thing as you. I mean, maybe I'm not sure. Right. But anyway, so I think this was a fruitful way of looking at this. And I feel pretty good about this idea. I think we kind of all agree that this has to be occurring, and we'll have to work out the details of it. And then let's see next here. So that was number one. Features and behavior model movements of the entire child. We just talked about that. Oh, no, we didn't talk about this. This is a new idea. Okay. In the past, when we talked about learning behavior models, we imagined to have like a little straw, and we'd see some change here. And then we could look and see a straw and see a change here. And then later we could do like this and see a straw here. So remember, we were like, oh, we didn't have time to see all these different change bits. And so we thought about, oh my gosh, how are we going to learn this model? We'd have to play it over and over again, look at different locations and so on. We have a completely different idea how this is going to work now. If you think about the child behavior object, we don't really want to look at these little features, all the little change bits. In fact, they're very misleading because they don't really tell you how the child object is moving. They tell you how an edge of the child object is moving, and they don't even tell you that because, if you're looking through a little aperture and you see an edge moving, you can't tell which direction it's actually moving. And so we've gone through that. Niels has some pictures of that. So that was a problem. We kind of realized that the way we were thinking about learning behavior models is like looking through straws and seeing these different learning modules will be looking through these things and seeing different things. That's not going to work. And what we really want to do is extract the movement of the entire child object. And that's not represented by bits up here, change bits up here. So that was a problem. But there's a pretty straightforward solution to figure out what is the movement of the entire child, which is what we want to know in the behavior model. So does anyone have a question about the problem we're trying to solve here before I get into it? 3, 2, 1. Okay, I can't see hands raised. If you want to say something, you have to speak up. So I say here already, before we described the features of the behavior model as local, as if you think of straw, and I said that local features don't reflect the movement of the entire child object. But we can detect the movement of the child object, similarly how we detect the movement of the entire retina. Now, if you recall, in our basic model of vision, for example, we feed in a movement vector into a learning module to tell how the eye is moving relative to the world. So, and the way we did that, if you think about the retina as being this big area here, and there's these magnocellular cells that have very large receptive fields, and if you sample over a set of those and you feed them to a spatial pooler, you'll get basically a movement vector of the entire retina. But it's required that you sample from the entire retina. That is, if you detect a common movement over the entire retina, that tells you the eye is moving. If you detect movement over some subset of the retina, that doesn't tell you that the eye is moving, right? That could be the object moving. But we assume that the entire pattern on your retina is moving, your eye is moving. It's not that the world is moving, your eye is moving. And we use that mechanism. We assume that mechanism in our basic, learning module for vision, at least in the biology. That's how we assumed it. So we'll come back to it if you don't understand that in a moment. But if we just, instead of saying, hey, let's look at the entire retina, let's just look at the area prescribed by the child, and you look at those magnocellular change bits in there, and you feed them through a spatial pooler, you'll get the same effect, but you'll get the effect of how is the child moving, not the whole retina. And it's the same basic thing, right? And so I'm going to stop there for a second. Did people follow that or not? I wish I had pictures of this, but they don't. Is there questions about?
Wouldn't this require like some model-based heuristic in the thalamus, or to detect the motion of the actual object versus
No.
the whole environment?
No, it requires two things. It doesn't require a model. It says I need to restrict my input to a part of the world. That is, I only want to look at the change bits, the magnocellular cells in a part of the world. That part of the world is going to be the part of the world occupied by the child. So I need a way of gating the input so I don't look at the entire retina. I only look at part of what the retina is sending in. That's the first thing you need. That's
But
not
how do you know that
model-based.
this mask? How do you figure out the mask if doesn't that need knowledge about the model dimensions and things like that, so that you
Right.
can restrict it?
So here's the next thing. I think I understand what you're saying, Ron. If you look in the cortex, if you look at a column in the cortex, let me just draw a column here. This is like this is one of our columns, and then we have our layers of cells and so on. Oops, I wanted to draw a line. So here's let's say I'm drawing here. Oops, I'm not very good at calendar. Let's say that's layer 3, and then this is layer 4. Sorry for my very poor drawing skills here. Why does it keep doing that? Oh, I see. I have to do this. Okay. So imagine that this is layer 4 and this is layer 3. They find in layer 3, in many columns, they find cells that are responsive to direction of movement of the receptive field, but they're often end-stopped, which means if you're looking at the retina and there's a line on the retina, if the line gets really long and it's moving, these cells don't respond to it. It's only when it's defined, when it's within a certain dimension, then they respond. And I always felt that the end stopping is what you need to make this work. You want to isolate a section of the world and see if it's moving, but you don't want that same section to be part that is moving if the entire world is moving. Like the entire retina moving, the section will be moving too. We don't want that. We only want to know when the part of the world that's represented by this child is moving and the rest of the world is not. So end stop cells are evidence that the brain does this. It basically says we're not going to respond unless it's restricted to some area. Now, the funny thing about end-stop cells is they're kind of weird and kind of variable. They're not always consistent, but this could be purely because it's in an anesthetized animal or the animal's not attending to something. And so my guess is that if the animal's attending to some area, there is a mechanism that says, yeah, we want to detect motion in this area, but not anywhere else. So if there's motion out here, then this doesn't count. It's like, if the whole world is moving, that's not what we want to report when this is moving and this isn't moving, or this is moving a different direction. I think that might be what you were talking about.
Yeah,
Ronnie?
yeah, I think so. So it could be based on some local features of edges or something like that, where the attention is, and it doesn't have to be the whole object.
Right. It's almost certainly there's no model-based thing going on here, and we know there's evidence it's doing it. It's not that hard to come up with an algorithm for doing it. So I think this is right. This is one of these things we came up with, and I said, it's like, okay, it was, we were struggling with this sort of feature by feature, looking through a straw child behavior object, and then Vivian suggested, hey, maybe it's like I just described, and I said, yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Anyway, so we're taking the exact same mechanism we use for determining movement of the retina, and we're just restricting it to a part of the retina or a part of the world. And so that makes things much, much easier. That means the features, I say that here, features in a behavior model are movements of the entire child. They're not representing movements of some part of the child or the entire child. And so now we have the ability to send movements over to the child, which are movements of the whole child. And it makes all things much easier.
I can share a figure from an actual neuroscience study that might give people a helpful.
Yeah, let me. You want me to stop sharing then?
Yeah, just quickly.
No, where is my stop sharing up here? We'll get to.
So yeah, this is Gilbert 1977, which let me remind myself what. Yeah, okay, it's cat visual cortex, and what they're showing here is recordings from different layers, so from 1 down to 6. And then they're basically showing different neurons had different optimal moving edges. And so the direction, like the optimal direction, was different for different cells. But also, as Jeff was saying, the kind of size of this moving edge was different in size. And so end stopping, if you're not familiar with the term, is basically that, like, you can imagine you can have a moving edge, and that stimulates the cell, and you make it longer, and in general that make the activity greater, but at some point it actually starts reducing the activity beyond a certain size. And so down here, the neurons kind of respond to these very large edges kind of moving, whereas up here you can see they're smaller. But actually, if you look at the axis here, so this is eccentricity from the fovea, but it's also an axis for the size of these receptive fields. And so a lot of these are around kind of 5 degrees, which is actually pretty big. Like, at least for a human, 1 degree is your fingernail held at arm's length. So 5 degrees, I guess, is kind of the size of your palm, roughly, held at arm's length. So that's pretty big. That is kind of, object scale. Yeah. But anyways,
this is a great figure. In fact, I read this many years ago and I actually reached the conclusion we just talked about back then. I said, "Oh, these cells would be good at detecting the motion of the retina. This would be good at detecting something that's smaller than the retina." A couple of things here. This is done, I think, of cats that are anesthetized, so they're showing them sinusoidal grading. So the actual data is kind of meaningless. It's sort of capturing the idea here. But in theory, if the animal's awake and looking at something, the size of these end stops would be determined by their attention window. And so since the cat has no attention window and is looking at sinusoidal gratings and it's asleep, who the hell's surprised they saw anything, but they did. So good for us. They did. This is a great figure. Thank you for bringing it up, Niels.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, and just it was interesting because the last times I had looked at it, I hadn't paid too much attention to the size of those upper ones, just that they were smaller than the lower ones. But it's interesting that they're still actually pretty big in terms of absolute degrees.
Right, but I think if we had an equivalent experiment with an awake animal attending to objects that they know about and attending to a window, we would predict that those things would be very precise. They would they would vary. And somehow the attention window dictates the size of the end stopping.
Yeah.
Right. So.
And I think to your question, Rami, I can imagine model-based signals being helpful in determining that attention. But I guess that, at least as a first pass, just like the motion itself could help define that. And
right.
We have connections going down to the TRN and maybe finding the attention. So that could be model-based.
There's clearly, in the work I was just doing on attention this week, I was breaking into 2 parts: the top-down attention, the bottom-up attention, and really figuring out the different attributes of them. But in the example we were just talking about, where something starts to move and you didn't anticipate it, then it's really bottoms up. Right. That's at least initially.
Niels, in that paper, if the direction of the arrow, like where things terminated, mattered? Like, can you do end stop at both ends, or is it just like at one end only? I don't know if that makes sense at all.
As in, so normally the end stopping, as far as I understand, is, so let's say the edge is moving like this. Yes. Normally the end stopping is they're growing the edge in this dimension.
Okay.
On both sides.
But on both sides.
So I guess the question is,
I don't think they grow one side. I think they grow both sides. And then
the question,
I guess from the center of the receptive field.
Yeah.
I see.
Right. What you actually see if you read the paper, what they show is that they're reporting the maximum firing rate for a cell. So they're saying, okay, we start with a little line that's moving, and we keep expanding it, and the cell's firing faster and faster and faster. And when it stops firing faster, that is extra increases. That's what they're reporting in that picture. And that's not end stopping. That's sort of like end losing interest. It's like the further you go, it doesn't even matter. But then some cells actually, the subset were actually end stopping, where it was like we made it bigger, they fired less. That was a subset, but I would argue that that was only a subset because there's a cat that's nearly dead splayed on a table, asleep, looking at sinusoidal gratings. So it's some of those things you can sort of read, between the lines a bit. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go back to
Sorry, I guess it just reminded me of, well, at least if it's just like one-ended, and I guess because I've been working on edge detection recently, it's that this could be kind of sort of a basis for detecting corners. So corners are two edges kind of intersected in some sense. They're considered a little bit more interesting features than edges in at least CV world.
But remember, we're not using this to detect features. But
I think corners can maybe help define attentional boundaries. Maybe,
but we don't really need that here.
Okay.
Because what we want, we're not trying to determine some sort of, the boundary is determined by where the edges are moving. That's all we really need. I said there's some perimeter things that are moving, and then that defines an area, and then you can say, all right, let's take all the bits that's in that area, and we don't really need to recognize it's really all about motion. All we're interested in right now is figuring out what is the motion of this field, and that's the feature that's going into the behavior model. If we wanted to detect an edge, then that might be the sort of more the static feature we're looking for, which is elsewhere. We're using elsewhere. But in this case, in the behavior model, the features themselves are movements, right? There is no morphology component to it. It's just movements. And the big change here is we're saying the movement's always going to be of the entire child. It's not like a local movement. It's of the entire child, and there is a very simple, plausible mechanism that we're already relying on to do that. It just requires the addition of attention and end stopping. If that all makes sense.
So far, yeah.
Okay, let me go back to sharing again here. So I think we were just discussing here. I said movements of the child object can be determined similarly to how we determine movement of the eyes using the magnocellular cells, but only use magnocellular cells in the attended area of the child object. As I described right here, that attended area is not model-based, it's just observational-based. It's like where are the cells moving? They define the attended area. Okay, so those are sort of the easy ones. We're ready to go on? Any further questions before we go on? Again, I can't see you.
Yeah, I'll edit the thumbs up.
Okay, I can't see that. It blocks too much of my screen. So then we spent a lot of time talking about behavioral states. So I posed this as a question. I said, objects can have multiple behaviors. So how do we represent the state of an object? This is something we talked about before. It's like you can think of like a stapler. We said, oh, the stapler can be open or closed. But then we said, oh, well, the stapler has this little thing called the anvil at the bottom, which deflects the staples, and that can be rotated in different positions. So is the state of the object, what about the state of the little anvil, or the stapler could have a little spring on the back, and I don't know, different things. And so we made up a bunch of stuff where I started using a car. I said, well, a car is an object and it has lots of behaviors. Each door can open and close. The windows can go up and down. There's different lights that can go on. It could be running or not running. So how do you represent the state of the car? Well, we had a lot of debate because up to now we've been saying there's a state variable in a morphology object. So we could say an object, there's a single object level state variable for the parent object, which clearly has difficulty representing multiple states. But then, Vivian argues, well, sometimes there's the dominant state. But to me, she's not here to defend herself, so I'm just going to go on. I'm going to say to me that each behavior has its own state. So if we could say, like, if an object has multiple states, then I can say, oh, what's the state of this part of it has multiple behaviors. I can say, what's the state of this? And what's the state of that? What's the state of the anvil? What's the state of the hinge? What's the state of the staplers? Or, what is the state of the door, the left door, the right door, that kind of stuff. So we had a lot of arguments about this. We're still friends. As you know, research PhDs can be
Sure, it's just a coincidence that she's not here right now, right?
Right.
Right.
So
I'm
we'll be
sorry.
waiting for her rebuttal in the Slack.
If you know, I'm sorry. I hope I'm representing. I mean, Vivian had some good points, but I think we kind of agreed in the end that you're going to need to, at times, at least have a state per behavior. And she's arguing that it might be also useful to have one at the object level. I moved on to just option B. And as Vivian was actually saying, you could have option C, which is a combination of A and B. I think that would be her position.
Yeah, which I think is that was always at least how we were mentally modeling it, that you would need a combination.
All right, I'm beyond that. So maybe Niels, you can represent this option C. I'm going to say, look, to me, you have to be able to represent the behavior of each, the state of each behavior. This because there's multiple behaviors. So just go there and do that. Now, we came up with a way of doing this, which I think is really kind of cool and fun, but we certainly didn't agree upon it. So I'm going to explore option B. Okay, that's why I'm
Can I
putting
ask
it
a clarifying question?
Yeah.
So when you say each behavior has its own state, does that mean each behavior has its the state is the state of the child morphology? Like, can you give me an example?
Each behavior. So remember, an object can have multiple behaviors, and each one has multiple behaviors. Each one will have a child object. But the state of the child object is really it's really where you are in the child's in the behavioral model. So, for example, a behavioral model may have two. Remember, a behavioral model plays out over time. That's one of its things. It always exists over time. It can be simple as two states, like, you go from the on to the up, or you go from the, on to off, or off to on, or it could be like you're swinging through an arc, or you're rotating a dial, or you're, Rami's exploding logo. Part of the logo goes, that kind of thing. But it's one per child. And so the state, if you imagine this is the flowing through time. The state of the behavior is where you are in that sequence flowing through time. You could be at the beginning, you could be at the end, you could be somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
But that's what I mean by a state of a child. So if we're talking about the top of the stapler that's hinging up, the state could be it's at the top, it's at the all the way down, or any one of these things in between, which are all represented as points in time going through this time-based model here.
Okay.
All right. So is that
I guess you'll get more into this, Jeff, but the consequence of this, just at a high level, is that with this approach, there is no state in morphology models at all. Like there's no state variable in a morphology model.
But we have something equivalent, which is going to work, and I'm going to talk about it in a second.
All right. So that clarifies my question. So
there is no separate, as Niels is saying, there's no like state variable up here, which is what we've talked about before. And that state variable would say, under state 1, you'd expect this morphology. Under state 2, you'd expect to see other features. We've gotten rid of this, at least I'm trying to get rid of this variable. It doesn't exist. But I have something which is even better. It does the same thing. Okay.
And just to clarify,
a great idea. I mean,
it also doesn't exist in the.
Sorry.
It also doesn't exist in the child morphology, right? Not just in.
A child morphology is just a morphology object. So these are equivalent. These are both the same type of thing. One has just got a hierarchical arrangement. So yes, there's no state variable. In fact, you'll see there's no state variable anywhere. But what we can think about then, but states are, you can think about a state as where you are on the sequence of a behavior. That is, is the door open or closed or in between? Is the switch on the upside or the downside? Is the dial, halfway around or all the way around? That kind of stuff, right? If it's the exploding logo and the word, I forget what parts of the exploding logo moved, but the word, project was flying around in space. Where is that word project at that moment in time? That's the state of that behavior. Okay.
The state in the behavior models is still meant to be capturing change, and so that's one of the subtleties there. It's not an end state. for
It's
example?
where you are in the change. Remember, it's like
Change progress.
behavioral model is a sequence of changes, right? Anywhere from two states to a flowing through to complex pattern. And so the state is this: where are you in that sequence? It's like a melody. You're at the first note, the last note, or some note in between. That's the state of the melody. It's the state of the behavior.
So this is more like a positional encoding, like where you are, but not really.
Yeah, let's just put it, because it doesn't always have to be position. It could be change in orientation. It would be best just to think of this. You can think of it sometimes like a position and movement, like the top of the stapler, but there's also the orientation of the top of the stapler, which is changing too. So to really specify a behavior, you're specifying where the child is and its orientation at that time. And sometimes behavior actually changes the child ID. Like you could, a letter A could turn to a letter B, something like that.
Well, I meant like a positional encoding in a sequence, like we're at position 1, 2, 3, 4.
Right. It would be
in some 1D sequence.
Right. The sequence would clearly be done using the temporal memory algorithm. The temporal memory algorithm doesn't necessarily have discrete points. It can, but doesn't always. And it's also time to time. So it could be a flowing sequence, or it could be a series of discrete points. It works best when there's like in melody, but it could be just a movement like the top of there's no discrete points as the stapler is moving up. It doesn't require discrete points. The temporal memory algorithm doesn't require that. Okay. So what's the idea here? I'm going to start with this sentence right here. Locations in a morphology model can be associated with more than one feature. And there can be multiple features at one location, but this only occurs when you're observing behaviors. So think about our morphology models. You go to some location. I don't have a picture of this. I'm sorry. You go to some location, we say, oh, what feature is there and what orientation is it? That's what the morphology models will learn. Now, what if I learn a morphology model, but later I come back and there's a different feature at that location? Or it has a different orientation. Or maybe there wasn't a feature before, but there is one now. Something's changed. You can think of that as an error. But if that change was occurring because of a behavior, it's not really an error. It just says, what occurs at some location on the morphology model's reference frame can vary based on the behavior. And so it's possible to have multiple. For some locations, you could have two links. You could say, sometimes at this location, I see an object at some orientation, and another time I see it at a different orientation. Or sometimes I see this, there was nothing here, and now, there's nothing here, but later there is something here. So what do we do about that? In the past, we haven't really answered that question. We've thought about like an error, like I'm supposed to have a letter A here, but now there's a letter B. What should I do about that? That's an error. What I'm going to say is that the morphology model will learn both. The morphology model is fine. Sometimes I see an A here, sometimes I see a B here. I will link this location to both an A and a B because that's what I've seen. So that's what I'm saying here. You can have multiple features at one location. And if this occurs, it only because there was a change, and it can only be a change because there's a behavior. So I walked this through here a little bit. When a change occurs on an object, our attention is moved to the location of the change. The feature at the change location is linked to the location. Therefore, a location can be linked to multiple features. So now our morphology model is not clearly defined. If I see a stapler with the top open, well, that's fine. I've seen that. And if I see it a bit closed, I've seen that. It's like those are both reality. I can't, if I go to some location, I can't tell you which one is supposed to be there because I can predict two things. I can predict it's either in this position or that position, or at this location there's nothing, or now it's a top, something like that. So all we're doing here is very simply, we're just saying at some locations, at some location on this object, let's say here, associated with that could be multiple features or multiple orientations of a feature, or it's no longer a one-to-one correspondence between the location on a morphology model and the feature at that location.
Do you, so for stapler opening, or for stapler, we typically think of the morphology model like looking like a staple. I don't know if you can see me, but I'm making with
No,
my
I
arms.
can't. I can't make
Okay.
hang on a second. All right, now I can see you.
Okay, like kind of a typical stapler.
Yeah.
In a stapler model, are you thinking of storing all the locations that span open to close?
If you looked at them,
Yeah.
it would store them.
Okay.
I mean,
So
now it again, if it's moving fast, you don't really have a chance to store them. But the point is, but let's imagine you could. You're just uh, you're it gets a little complicated. So you're actually not looking at the edge of the top of the stapler anymore. You're looking at the actual entire morphology model of the top of the stapler. And so the
right.
child object has different, the child object as a unitary thing, it's got different positions and different orientations. And I could say, let's say we assume we store all the ones we observe. So if I see it moving and it's moving not too fast, I would store all of them.
Yeah.
Again, it gets much easier if you assume that the thing you're storing is not all the individual points, but
Right.
the model's location and orientation. In fact, all you have to do is there one location on the top, and
Yeah.
that'll apply to the entire top, right? It's like
Right.
because that's the way it works.
But
So-
Yeah,
there will
and
still
then
be
I
multiple
guess-
points for each top. Like there will still
it's
be.
just
I mean,
imagine.
yeah, you might do, but I guess for clarity, I guess the key difference here is with the other way we've talked about state in the past. You remember, like we sometimes talk about it as like a keyframe that, like when the staplers
Yeah.
stop moving, you would learn the stapler. And I think here,
Right,
Jeff,
right.
you're still arguing like there might be a tendency to learn, the object in certain conditions. The important difference is how it's represented, which is that
Okay.
with kind of keyframes and state and morphology models, that learning module would be in the state of like, okay, open stapler. So conditioned on open stapler, this is what I'll predict in my reference frame. The
Yeah.
proposal here is that all of those all those features at locations are all essentially in the same reference frame. They're
Yeah.
all kind of homogenized.
Right.
And so that's like the setup. And then so in order to then still make meaningful predictions, I guess that's the next thing you're going to talk about, Jeff, which is
Right.
which
Okay.
is the linking with the behavior model. And
Got
that's
it.
basically going to provide the context necessary to make a meaningful prediction.
Let's
But I guess
assume
that's a little independent, I guess, from how many of those stapler openings you have in any of these approaches, B or A and C or A and B or whatever. We still need to decide like what is a compact representation.
Okay.
I'm trying to draw a rectangle here, and it's not drawing it. Well, now it did. What the hell is the difference? Okay, let me just imagine the thing we're looking at here is actually a switch, all right? And the part we're tending to is actually just the moving part, which is just the little this bar here,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
We're tending
Yeah.
this, and so now at one point I say, oh, there's a child object here. This little bar, it's in this position orientation, and then later I come back and I see a different situation. The first one's gone and the second one's there.
Yep.
So the morphology model will learn, oh, sometimes I see this here, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I see this here, sometimes I don't. If I saw the switch moving, and it moves, slow enough that I could observe it, which is not, I might learn that, oh, there's nothing like this,
Yeah.
there's a union here, a different at any point in time. Sometimes I saw this, sometimes I saw this, sometimes this. So it's a union of all these positions.
Mhm.
And there's a couple of consequences of this. The first one's a minor consequence. Is if I go up and I see the switch, if I see it in the up position or the down position, I don't think it's odd. I don't say, hey, that's changed. It's just like, let's say some temporary memory of what it was.
Yeah.
Those are both logistic things of switches. But notice these things don't all occur at the same time. And the whole point is I only learned these. I formed them when I first observed the switch changing.
Yeah.
That's when I did this. And what we're going to do then, when we learn the switch changing, we're going to associate that with a state in the behavior model. So,
Okay.
and then if I had a different thing here, it's a different state in the behavior model.
Yeah.
So, and this just happens naturally because I've observed the change, I observed the new feature at that location. We've started or existing a behavior model, and I just link that this feature at this location on this object is linked to this point in the behavior model. Now it turns out, as if you might recall, that for a switch, we actually learned two behavior models: one for the switch moving up and one for the switch moving down. Because those are so separate and independent movements. They don't always occur together. Unless it's a down-up always, then it would be one behavior model. But if it's not a down and up, if it's either up or down, it's two behavior models. So now here's the beautiful thing about this. Just seeing this thing, let me go back to having a little highlighter here. Just seeing this feature now in the future links to the correct behavior for that feature in that position. So we'd say, hey, that is associated with a behavior of the switch going down. So it's an affordance. It's also the state. It says the state of this behavior model is I'm at the beginning. If I saw it, in the middle, I could say, oh, it could be either moving up or moving down. I can't tell. It would invoke two behavior models, both in the middle of the sequences of those behavior models. So if I saw the switch in the middle, I say, oh, I can move it up or I can move it down. If I see at the end, I just invoke the down movement. And I see at the bottom, I invoke the up movement. It sort of becomes an affordance. It becomes an affordance. It also becomes the state. So they're literally just seeing this feature at this location, at this orientation, is the state of this behavior relative to this, this point on the parent object. And so there's really no separate state variable. The actual feature only occurs in the certain state of the behavior. So it is a local state variable. It's not like I have one thing. It's just I have lots of things that I link point to point. I can say, oh, it's not like I have a single variable appears it on or off. It's like, no, this means it's on, this means it's off, and I invoke the correct behavior and the correct state of the behavior by doing that. So this is what I tried to say here before I go on. Locations in the morphology model can be associated with more than one feature. These occur when you have behaviors. When a change occurs on an object, our attention moves to the location of change. The feature at the change location is linked to the location. We always talk about it. Now. The latest thing was the change feature is associated linked to the state of behavior model. When this feature is observed, it invokes behavior model at the correct location in the behavior model. So I really like this idea a lot. Vivian was a little bit. And maybe Niels could represent her position, but she thought this was a big change, and she didn't like it because it was a big change of some. I thought it was it's beautiful, but it gets rid of state variables.
I agree that's a big change. But this is a minor question in detail. We don't have to figure out now. But when the state for the switch, this is, let's say you see it on the up position. Do you need to disambiguate whether that is the end of the moving up or the beginning of moving down?
Right. I think we didn't work out that detail. Okay. I would think in general it would be at the beginning of moving down. It's like, when I see it in the up position, I don't feel like, hey, I did this. It's more like, I can do this. It's like if I see a button, it's hard not to push the button, right? It's like, oh, there's a button, I need to push it. Like it tells me that I should start the behavior right now. Right. If I see the button in the down position or the flattened position, I don't feel like there's nothing I feel I can do. It's like it's done. It's already pushed. It's like I have to do something else. So I think it would be, but I think when we think about causal links, the down switch, the down position, the end of a behavior, like the switch is moving down, the down position can be causally linked to something. So the light only turns on when the switch reaches the bottom of its travel. Mm-hmm. So you can causally link to the beginning or the middle or the end of a sequence of the behaviors. But I think that, I don't know that, OJ, we have to we have to work it all
Yeah,
out.
it's one of the kind of, I don't know if you want to call it an issue, but it's definitely one of the unsolved things about this model is yeah, like because that's kind of what I was emphasizing before, that like the states in the behavior model are always a transition.
Mhm.
But obviously, when we at least talk about states in a morphology model, we're talking about like an end state,
Yeah.
or like things
Well,
aren't moving, and so it's
no,
not that
well,
they can't be linked, but there is some inherent ambiguity there, and so there's a question of
well.
how we link them.
I think it's not too much ambiguity. It's very easy to link the observed feature with the beginning of the behavior or with the middle of the behavior, or anything up to the end of the behavior, because it's just like at any point, if the behavior model is moving, even if it's just starting, because it just started, it's beginning, I can link the change I observed with the beginning of the behavior model. So that's not a problem. The problem is if somehow the only issue we have to deal with is at the end of the behavior model. Um, if that's I don't even know it's an issue. I just don't think we worked it out. I don't think we actually came up with an example where we tried to walk it through. So we can leave that as Niels and Vivian and I can leave it as sort of unexplored territory. Uh, I don't think it's going to be hard to make it work at all, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Um, so um, those are the. This took us 4 days to come up with these four things. So maybe we're not, maybe we're slow, but
Yeah,
there's a
and
lot
maybe
of.
one additional one, I don't know if you're going to talk about, was like the reverse, which is the behavioral state helping predict in the morphology model. Um,
But that's the thing I couldn't do, right? Is the red movement vector here? Is that what you're talking about?
no, as in no, so not when movement starts happening, but as in so like I guess just was saying, if you see the switch in the up position, that kind of like in at least in some cases uniquely defines the state in the behavior model. Sometimes it's ambiguous, sometimes it links to multiple states. But now you're going to saccade and look somewhere else in your morphology model. Now you know what the state is. How do you correctly predict what you're going to see?
When you look someplace else, am I no longer looking at this behavioral area? I'm looking somewhere area on the object.
Well, now you're looking like at the bottom where the switch is going down, and you want to correctly predict that you're not
Oh,
going to see the switch there because you've already inferred the state. So this was the thing we talked about with the bidirectional L4.
right, right, right. Well, I guess that was a legitimate question.
Um,
Maybe I can phrase it with the L4 problem. Is that right?
yeah,
So so what we're doing here is we're trying to, there's an SGR which represents the child behavior and where we are in the child behavior, like where we are in the sequence. And there's a bunch of cells that are active. It says, okay, the child object is at some location orientation at this point. And then we have an SGR up here, which is like, this is a child behavioral, a morphology child is at some points. This is an SDR. So we have an SDR here and we want to link it to an SDR here. Well, those SDRs, these can't be the location SDRs because the location SDRs doesn't show a union of features. It has to be like the layer four. This would have to be layer four, or something like layer four. Um, and that has to be linked to something like layer four down here. So the first guess is like, oh my, well, that says there's a layer four to layer four connection, which just kind of violates one of the things that layer four does. Layer four doesn't generally project elsewhere in the cortex. So that was then we started looking into, hey, are there any evidence of this? And I think Niels quickly found a paper. Oh, there's maybe, did you? I can't remember. Like sometimes layer four projects someplace. I don't know. But that was sort of an unresolved issue about what cellular layers are doing this here and here, and yeah, I have if I can really confuse everybody, at one point Vivian said, I'm going to use the excuse that she said it first. She said, maybe the child object, behavioral object, and the child morphology object actually really are in the same column, the same learning module. And which is where we started. All right, that's where we started, and because that would solve this problem.
Right.
And so we didn't spend time on that. But in the back of my mind, I said, because we were arguing enough already, I said, I'm going to work on that again. I'm going to think about that again. Because why did we separate them out? The only reason we separated them out is because we wanted to apply a behavioral model to different morphology models. And that's the reason. Otherwise, it worked okay. And so I have some idea that
Yeah, and we didn't want two reference frames in a column.
we didn't want two reference frames, but that's because they had to be that's because this reference frame could change, and the same behavioral model would apply to different reference frames here. If they were combined into one unit, it wouldn't have that problem. So, but then you would say, well, how could I apply my child behavioral model to a novel morphology model? And I'm not saying it's going to work. I'm just saying it's worth thinking about again, and I'm going to do that because there's this issue of like, oh, really, we're requiring these layer 4 to layer 4 connections. By the way, there's no harm in forming those connections. It's easy. It's the question is there any evidence for that? It's like
and there was also some challenges like with an SDR to an SDR. So yeah, just for context, so what that's trying to do is kind of what we had before, where like based on what state you think the stapler is in, it's open or closed, you're going to predict the kind of correct morphology. So yeah, in theory, I guess this could help with that. One challenge there in terms of the kind of generalization that you're saying of like a behavior to a new morphology is like that SDR is going to predict a specific feature at a specific orientation at a specific location.
Right.
But so how do we generally just predict an orientation at a location and kind of generalize away from a particular feature ID and stuff like that?
Right. One thing you just said, Niels, which I want to reiterate, I'm still trying to understand it myself. We keep thinking about all these features up here, but really it's an entire child object. I keep slipping and we're detecting some little feature up here. No, we're detecting an entire child object here, and we're moving the entire child object. So somehow we want to be able to associate a behavioral model with a different entire child object model, and we don't have to do it on a location by location basis. We just have to say, how can this behavior model be applied? If it was put in the same learning module as like, okay, the shape of the switch, the behavior of moving the switch is associated with the shape of the actual physical rocker part of the switch. How would I apply it to something else? Well, anyway, these are questions we didn't answer. But so the way I described it with these green arrows would work just fine, except it looks like it has to be layer 4 to layer 4, which that seems to violate one of the rules about layer 4. That doesn't do that. So, it's an interesting thing, just a little detail in neuroscience. From the very beginning, people said, oh, layer 4 cells, these are these binary stellate cells. And one of the definitions of them is they don't have apical dendrites. And they don't project outside of the local region. That layer 4 doesn't connect it to other distant places. But at some points in the cortex, there are pyramidal cells in layer 4. And there's some in V1, they're just a small percentage, but the percentages go up elsewhere. And one could say maybe and pyramidal cells, by definition, always do project outside of the local region, the local column. That's part of their definition. So if I had a lot of pyramidal cells in layer 4, I wouldn't have a problem. Right? It's only if I assume there's only finite stellate cells in layer 4, then we have a problem. So it could be that maybe some regions like V1 are not very good at associating. In fact, they wouldn't, because they wouldn't have a child behavior object. V1 cannot have a child behavior object because there's no children to V1. But if maybe when you get to V2, you might see a lot more pyramidal cells in layer 4. And maybe when you get to like some high regions, there might be even more still. So that could be one of these sort of confounding things that said, yeah, we don't see these cells projecting elsewhere, but maybe that's only true for primary regions. Maybe in the non-primary regions, we do see them projecting there. So, and then people make this thing like, oh, layer 4 cells don't have, they're all spinate stellate cells. Well, maybe that's only true in V1. And that's where they spent most of their time looking. So these are all possibilities.
But even if you have pyramidal cells, like I can see them connecting to other layers, but they still wouldn't connect to other layer fours and other columns necessarily, right?
Well, first of all, the first question is, um, do they leave the local column?
Yeah.
And if they're a pyramidal cell, they leave the local column.
Okay.
Now, this then requires someone says, let's trace those pyramidal cells in layer 4 and see where they go. And they might go to layer 4s in other areas. I don't know. I've learned enough about neuroscience that something has become dogma about, oh, these cells are here and these are what they do. And there's always exceptions to them. And sometimes those exceptions are really important and sometimes they're not. So I'm just suggesting that it may be, if you look in the right places, go away from primary sensory regions, you will see a bunch of layer 4 pyramidal cells that project to other pyramidal cells, or they don't have to project the pyramidal, they don't have to project the layer 4 someplace else. So it's possible. I'm not saying it exists. I'm just saying this is an area we didn't resolve. I just love the idea that the actual union of features, those union features, become the states of this behavior, and that just by looking at it, it invokes the behavior. It immediately tells you what am I able to do with this, and that's a nice little one-to-one correspondence. And so and it gets rid of state variables and it makes the state per behavior make it work. So that's it. Those are all the ideas we had. Unless Niels has some more.
Can I?
No, yeah. Thanks for so much. Oh yeah, go ahead, Remy.
Can I share a visualization that might be
Sure,
useful?
Yeah.
Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, a while back I shared something like this. I think the intuition might be a little bit similar, or like this does not get into as much details as what you got into, Jeff. But I was also thinking of that the behavior, that we'd only have states in the behaviors, and these states would not be. It would be also like a position in a sequence. So, for example, if you look at the reference frame on the left, it's moving. I had to show it in somehow, but it's basically like where you are in this opening sequence and this hinge behavior. And then in the object reference frame, in the morphology reference frame, we don't have states, right? It doesn't change. It doesn't move as you change the behavior. The actual representation of the object at the specific state in a behavior is just basically the association between them. So as you move,
that's the same thing. So if you figure this out and we forgot it, sorry about that, Rami. I think
no worries. I couldn't explain it. But yeah,
right.
Yeah.
I think the thing which sort of freed my mind up for this, and I don't know if you were finished, but I think this is exactly the same thing. What freed my mind up about this is the idea that you could have a union of features at some location in a morphology model, right. And that union those are actually the choice you have at that union really represents the state of the behavior at that point. It's linked to that. Yep. So that was the thing that broke my mind open about this.
So this feature over here of the stapler, this could trigger the behavior state here, as well as this feature over here. It could trigger the same behavior state because they're both features at the same behavior state. Similarly, you could do the same thing if you just start moving your eyes. So the behavior is not changing, but if you could just start moving your eyes on morphology, you can actually, like if you have two different behaviors or two different behavior states, they can help you make a prediction here in the morphology object because it's still the same thing. The association between the behavior state and the morphology object is going to give you this full model, and this is a different behavior state, and the morphology object is going to give you a full model. That was the same morphology model, but as you're moving on it, you can make predictions in the morphology object because just because of this association again. So the animation just shows what I mean here.
I'm not following us, although clearly we
So
can
are
do
you
this.
showing that in the morphology model that it's kind of learned a superposition of the different
Right. So,
state, or like
this location,
the partially
this
open stapler
location,
and the closed stapler?
yeah. So, I guess what I
Because
mean
I
here is
guess
that
on the right, I see the like just stapler in like the canonical position.
yes, so it doesn't change. So when you're making predictions on the stapler in the morphology object, you can make prediction on the canonical object, but it's the association between the behavior state and the morphology object is what gives you this is what allows you to make the correct prediction.
Oh, I see. I think Niels was getting at, it's like you were doing a transform here as opposed to a union of states, a union of
Yeah, because
morphologies.
at least in the thing that we were describing before, it's more like it'll have all of the staplers like superimposed. So I'm just
Right.
yeah.
Here I was
Right.
talking about two different objects with different features being tied to the same behavior state, or as the behavior state changes, you can tie two different features at that same behavior state. But in the other example, I was talking about just one object and multiple behavior states. The behavior states are moving, and how you would basically make predictions in the object reference frame. But yeah,
I'm a little bit confused. I'm not. I'm not. We're solving the same problem. I'm not sure if you're solving it in the same way we just talked about. I'm confused a bit. It's like
okay,
what does your morphology model look like? Is it do you have two like keyframes, or is this a union, or well, what is it? Is it or is it
the
just have
morphology model.
or does it just have a canonical form?
The morphology model is just a canonical form; doesn't have states.
Okay, so
what we have
maybe
here in the
that's
middle is the association between the morphology and the behavior state.
maybe this is different then, because the idea we just presented is that there is no canonical form. It's all the forms you've observed union together in some sense. Right? It's like so the open stapler is a just as legitimate image of the stapler as the closed stapler. There's no preference there. They're just like, oh yeah, I've seen it open, I've seen it closed. I'm forming a union of for the thing that's moving. I'm forming a union of the different places that thing can be.
Right. Yeah.
So that in that sense it might be different. I'm not, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I think we're saying the same thing, but it's when I talked about this here before, I talked about how we can actually represent locations as they are not an actual physical 3D location, but they can be multiple locations just represented with a single SDR. And I think that would be the actual representation of the column, which would be represented by these multiple locations, because this representation is just it represents these multiple locations. So when you have a behavior
is
state,
that multiple locations in a behavior model or in a like which column?
It will be stored in the morphology model and not in the behavior. The behavior model does not have these locations; just has the state where you are in the behavior. But it will trigger basically if you are like in the open state, it will trigger that location in the morphology model. So you'll basically be predicting this, not this. So it depends on where you are. Yeah.
And you were saying if an STR could invoke multiple locations is a sentence you said, and I've presented just the opposite. A single location can predict multiple feature orientations. And so in the case that we just described, the reference frame is immutable. It doesn't change. It's got a unique representation for each location, but those locations can be associated with different features which are observed at different times during a behavior. And not the words you just said were the opposite, so I'm not sure, but I'm not really following it.
The reference frame doesn't change. So you're saying that it would be representing a union of multiple locations as just a union of SDRs?
No, there's not multiple locations. It's just like if I go to some location on an object in the morphology model, in a static object, it tells you what feature you should see there. What is the child ID and what's its orientation? And now we're saying it could predict more than one. It can say, hey, sometimes there's no feature in orientation there. Sometimes there's one, sometimes there's two, sometimes there's three. So it's really a location in the morphology object's reference frame can predict a union of possibilities in layer 4. And all those
so
are
maybe at
acceptable.
a neural level, if it's helpful to imagine, your reference frame, if you believe you're on that object, it's the same reference frame and it doesn't change. You move over the object, and at a given location, different things can come into L4 that might change over time, in which case multiple things could be bound to a given location. So that might be, a stapler that has like a little diode that goes green and red or something, maybe it's battery powered or something like that. So both those things would be bound to the same location in the reference frame, and the morphology model would have no way, without communicating with the behavior model, predicting which of those particular things it will see. And then in the case of the stapler opening, as the stapler opens, you're going to kind of new locations in this reference frame, and you're binding whatever features like the stapler top at all those locations. I think
So
what
if you
you're
have,
showing here is more like different locations are being bound to. There's almost like two levels of location representation. I think there's like a sort of unique one, and then there's the location in the canonical model.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is it's different in this sense, but yes. So what you're talking about is basically if you have two features, two different models that are bound to the same behavior, you would be storing these two features.
It's not two models. There's a morphology model which has.
I guess there wasn't really too much discussion yet about how you reuse a behavior for a new morphology. That's actually one of the challenges to work out, because
it would be the same thing, right? Because you're getting different features at the same behavior state. So you'd just be storing.
I mean, if you were going to learn them, but
I don't think
that wouldn't necessarily generalize.
I don't think there's an issue of that particular. I think this all works really nicely when you apply it to a new object. We'd have to walk through in detail, but I don't see the problem there.
It was just working out the we were talking about the SDR to SDR that normally includes feature ID, but normally if we're applying it to a new morphology, the easiest way to do that is to change the feature ID. Like to have a different child object.
Well, this is why
instead of the stapler top, it's the French fry or whatever.
Right, but that's why if you, in the first diagram, the only diagram I showed, where you had like a paired child and a child morphology object and a child behavior object, the behavior object tells you location and orientation changes via a movement vector, but it doesn't know anything about the child object ID. So that's the mechanism.
Because we had the example of the behavior where it changes, like the behavior is a change in object ID.
Right.
A to B to C.
Right. And in that case, so we didn't go into that today, but we could. In that case, you can't necessarily, then it has to be either it's tied to a specific set of child features or it can't be done. Like if I go from maybe I see the sequence goes, I see letter A, and then it turns to letter B, and then it turns to letter N, and it turns to letter X. That's my sequence, A, B, N, X. Well, okay, I can learn that, but I can't apply it to, bike, car, dog, and cat.
Right. In that case, it is specific. Yeah,
it's very specific. And then we had the example of the traffic light where we said, okay, red, yellow, and green. Well, I could then say, I could have a red, yellow, and green transition on another parent, but it'd be difficult to predict purple, orange, and violet or whatever.
Right.
So that's like a corner case, I think, where you really can't You can't make a generalization about it. It's just is what it, so we have to explain how could you associate with a particular child object that you say, well, this behavior is tied to a specific child object, and I can predict it on as long as you use the specific child objects, but if you're going to use some other child objects, it's not going to work.
Right.
So I have a question. When we're making a prediction, the morphology model, do we actually can we make a prediction on some canonical model, just like we make it's the same way that we do this transform back from the thalamus into the model by just changing the movement to go back into the canonical model or into the model that stored the initial rotation of the object. The way I'm thinking about this is that
I didn't follow that.
So are you talking about an object that's moving, or let's say we come across the open stapler?
So yeah, I'm talking about an object that's moving, but right now the way that we do it in Monty, with that no moving of objects, right? The way that we do it in Monty is that we store the object at specific rotation and specific
a child.
Yeah,
a child.
No, just a single morphology model, just a single column. What we do is we learn.
We learn it at some orientation, but it's sort of indifferent, right? It's just chosen. It's random, right? It's all self-consistent, right? It's self-consistent. It's not. Okay.
But what we do is that we infer the rotation, and then we send it to the thalamus so that the movement is being rotated.
Right. The rotation relative, like if your head turned or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking, would it be the same for behaviors to basically to be able to make a prediction of the morphology features, that we would be going back to the canonical model where we learned the object and make predictions there? So it'd be something like this, where we would be making predictions here, and the context that we need is basically the behavior state. So the behavior state, if it's open, then this is what we would need to revert the movement and location to figure out where we are in this canonical object. In this sense, the morphology model would not change, and we wouldn't have any states. It's going to be the same way that we're correcting for rotation. We'd just be correcting for where we are using the behavior state.
I'm not following, Rami, but can we just back up for a second, a moment? When we learn a composite object, and all objects are composite objects. Basically, every object is only consists of children at some orientation. And when we learn that, we have to calculate the relative orientation of the child to the parent, and we're using the thalamus for that, right? So the logo could be at this point could be a disorientation of that orientation, or the top of the stapler could be at this orientation or different orientation. The same is true for behavioral objects, right? It's no different. It's just the same type of object. So when we're talking about, I didn't follow what you said, but what I'm thinking, like, whatever you're thinking, we should just be thinking that the relationship of a behavioral child to a parent is exactly the same as a morphological child to a parent. So when we learn something, we're learning it in the exact same way, and we're using the thalamus the exact same way. So I don't know if that addressed. I'm just trying to figure out.
Maybe it'd be helpful. I think it relates to the thing you were asking me to recap, Jeff. The slides that Vivian made at one point. So yeah, this is some stuff Vivian presented a while back on how we could kind of apply motion in a learned behavior model to basically correct for that motion in order to correctly predict what we're going to see. And you can imagine two situations where there's motion and behavior. So in both cases, there's a behavior, the stapler opening and closing. But in one case, our sensor is going to follow the object and what's moving. And the other one, our sensor is going to stay in the same position, and the object is going to move kind of through that receptive field. And so to orient you, so what we're looking at is two columns. One is modeling the stapler top. This is then a child object of a behavioral model that's modeling the kind of hinge behavior. And so in this case, we assume we've kind of learned the hinge behavior, that we have this kind of motion going in these two directions that could.
I'm sorry. Is the behavior model on the lower left or on the right?
Is on the right.
Why is it set a higher level? I thought
Um,
the behavior model would be. Oh.
This is how we've often described it: is that you would learn, the stapler top. So it's not the whole stapler that's a
Yeah.
child; it's the stapler top. So
Right, but
rather
then
than just direct flow,
what's on
you're getting in that the orientation of the stapler is changing.
Okay, I guess this is the right one is supposed to be a behavior model,
Yeah.
and so we're saying the behavior model here we're showing the whole stapler, even though we're picking out. Okay, um,
It's I mean, there's a whole stapler in the world, but this column is just modeling a
right.
stapler top.
But the one on the right is this looks like we're showing a subset of the whole stapler. It's the behavior model is really the thing in the square in the middle where the arrows are moving. Is that right?
This thing?
On the
Or
right,
you mean this
yeah,
thing? Yeah. This is the behavior model, and right here it's shown as kind of like lots of small local flow, but you can imagine it's a more kind of global flow.
Okay.
But the point is, that this has learned this kind of series of movements that happen as opening and closing takes place. That's informed by movement coming in here. But what we basically want to do is be able to move through this morphology model and make correct predictions about what we're going to see. And then the idea was to use movements here to basically correct for the movement that we're estimating in this lower level column.
But that low level column is just the child. It's just the top, right?
This is just the child, yeah.
So what we really need to do, and this is what's getting me confused yesterday, we want to change the orientation of the top to the parent stapler, not just the top itself. It's just the top. I mean,
yeah, but we do have a location in this reference frame,
right? So we're looking at some point in that reference frame.
Yeah,
but it's just the top. It's not the whole stapler,
right? And its orientation in the world is also going to change.
Right, but okay, we can right. Okay, yes.
And so if we take this movement and we essentially apply the inverse, then in this case, so as the kind of stapler top moves, we can maintain the same location in this reference frame. So does it show it here? Basically, the idea is that if you were following the stapler and it was going up, you're moving your sensor, and so without any additional intervention, this column is going to receive, oh, my sensor's moving, so I need to move through the reference frame. But this movement that your sensor is doing is the inverse of the movement that you've learned here. And so the idea is that these can cancel each other out. And that would, in this case, mean that when you follow this with your eyes, you would actually predict to see the same thing correctly down here. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the two scenarios.
We don't have to follow the stapler as it's moving now because we're looking at an attention window and we're just getting some global behavior state rather than a local feature. Is that correct? Or?
Say that again.
We've changed our mind about, in this proposal, we were talking about a global, like some behavior state of the whole object rather than just looking at a specific small motion vector, local motion vector. So maybe we don't have to follow the object anymore with our eyes to figure out that this is the right behavior that should correct for this location.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of an independent question. I think whether you have to follow it to recognize the behavior is that the question? Because as in like whether you can infer this? How you
if we can infer it and we can get a behavior state, then we could use that behavior state to correct for the location in the morphology model.
Right. This is a mechanism for correcting for that. I think it's a different question how you infer the behavior, which that could use voting, that could use more global model free flow. like we were talking about
Okay.
today, or it could use. I think another thing we talked about at the retreat was just that obviously flash inference of a sub object like this is also useful. Like at any given moment, you can kind of recognize the stapler top, and whatever changes are happening there, like in the orientation, feed that up. Um, yeah, does that help?
Yeah, this is what I was asking. Like using the behavior to correct for the location and keeping the morphology model the same as we learned it. It's not opening and closing. There are no states. You're just
Yeah, because this is
using
the
the behavior
child object, but then this is the child object, but then we still have the parent morphology, um, in what Jeff was showing, where you would have learned the arm in many different states.
Yeah. I'm talking about the two columns at the same level, the child behavior and the child morphology.
Yeah, so then that could use a mechanism like shown here.
I know what was confusing me now, because I was trying to think through this yesterday. What was confusing me, and this says, oh, if I'm just looking at the stapler top, it tells me what to expect, right? So that's good. It says, I think I get that. But there's a relationship between the stapler top as a child of the entire stapler. And if I learned those originally before I saw the movement, I would have associated points in the reference frame of the stapler to particular orientations of this child feature in its location. So those are like hardwired, that's our compositional structure. That's the layer 6A to layer 6A projection, that we've assigned this child object to some location in the parent. But now the child starts moving, those connections are invalid now. So although if I'm just looking at the stapler top, I make the right prediction. This system tells me how to make the right prediction if I'm just looking at the stapler top. But it seems like the relationship between the stapler top and the rest of the stapler is kind of confusing now, because the previously learned connections saying, no, the stapler top is supposed to be at some orientation to the stapler, and it's not anymore. It's like, I guess that was where I was getting confused. I was getting confused about, I was trying to like, how do I change those connections between like the compositional prediction between, here's where the story, like here's where the logo is on the coffee cup. Now the logo moves. My previous connections telling me where the logo is are wrong, and I guess I was that, and I can predict where this, looking at the logo, where it's going to be if the logo is moving. I'm sorry, if the logo is moving. I can look at where the logo is going to be, but my relationship to the parent object is incorrect now. I guess that was the confusing part to me. Do we learn multiple layer 6 to layer 6 connections then? I didn't think about that.
Yeah.
Is my question obvious? Is it clear?
I think so. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think this would still infer that like the orientation of the stapler's changed. So I think whatever it's going to pass up to the parent column, the parent morphology model, is still going to be useful. It's still going to tell it like, oh, stapler arm's now here. And it's correct for it to say, oh, I'm at this location in my reference frame when you're at your location in the reference frame. So I think all the information it's passing up is correct. I guess maybe the more the question seems to be that if we're getting state from here,
where are you pointing?
From the behavior model.
Okay.
And state is telling us where we are in the parent model, then maybe that is sufficient to tell us what to see down here. And we don't actually need to apply these movements.
Maybe I think I might have, I might have come up with my own answer to this question, or at least a way to think about it. Is earlier we were saying, hey, we can form a union of orientations and locations for observed features, right? So as the object is moving, we said, yes, we can rapidly form a union of these things. We assume that we can do that quickly. So whether it's hippocampus or cortex doesn't matter. But so maybe that's the answer here. The answer is yes, there's an established layer 6 to layer 6 connection between the parent and the child. But as the child moves, we're essentially forming new connections as we go. That's the definition of forming a union in the parent. And maybe that union idea just says, as we move, we form new. That is the union. We're forming new layer 6. There's a union of layer 6 to layer 6 connections. That's the definition of a union. So maybe there's not a problem at all. I was.
Yeah, right. I don't think it's an issue to have multiple locations in the parent associate with with a location in the child.
I was thinking these layer 6 feedback conjections for compositional structure were sort of like hardwired and fixed. And now when I start moving the child, they're wrong. And they are wrong. But just a moment ago, we said, well, when we start moving the child, we're going to form a union of the new observations. Well, those new observations are literally the layer 6 to layer 6 connections. So it's like, that's the answer. We said we're going to learn them quickly as we go.
Right.
So maybe that's the whole thing. I just didn't put one and one together to get two.
Yeah. And then did it make sense when I was saying that it feels like maybe then we could just rely on those top-down connections to tell us where where we are in this reference frame.
Maybe. I think so. So what I would personally, what I want to do is try to sit down and think through this myself, because that's always more effective for me. But I think, yes, it sounds good. So, but I haven't internalized it yet myself.
Yeah.
So,
and then I guess, Vivian was mentioning on Slack in our smaller thread that, we could also correct to a certain degree in more model-free way if we're getting this kind of global movement. Like this correction being shown here, that doesn't necessarily need to come from a learned behavior. That could come from, well, as in if we're just detecting that an object is moving.
You're saying we'd be sending all this information regardless of whether we've learned the behavior or not.
Yeah, exactly. That's what she suggested, and I kind of like that because I feel like a lot of behaviors, or a lot of movement in the world isn't a behavior. So like a plate moving across the table or a car driving forward or whatever. Those aren't like stereotype behaviors, but we still do a decent job of kind of predicting how things are going to change. And
I can't really predict.
Like maybe the predictions wouldn't be as good as if it was a really stereotype behavior, like a pendulum. But
the predictions might be okay if I consider that I assume that the movement's going to continue the way it is right now. But if the movement's going to change,
that's all you could do, right? Yeah, right. And I think you would be surprised if a plate's sliding across the table and it suddenly goes in a different direction.
I guess so. But I wouldn't be surprised if a mouse did that, or.
I guess, I don't. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I see that.
So often when we talk about behavior, it's like, oh yeah, it's this thing. It happens over and over again. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do with all these objects that just kind of just move?
Right. I think that's a good point. I always say a learned behavior has to repeat. Right. If I'm going to have a model of it, I have to repeat. So now we're considering a sense of what is the behavior that's not learned. Well, in some sense, if I want to think of like linear movement, well, that you could argue that's a learned behavior. It's like, okay, the object moves in a straight line, so I can invoke the object moves in a straight line. But I wouldn't necessarily have. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I get a better idea. So I think we have to deal with that issue about really understanding the difference between moving a plate on a table, which I argue is not a behavior of the plate.
Right.
But we have to explain the mechanisms for that and and so on. So I think we can tie these together. So I think what we have, maybe in summary, what we got here is we have, at the moment we're still sticking with, we have a parent object has one or more behaviors. Each behavior is associated with a single child object and a single behavior model. And that's the structure we're dealing with. We have the potential that the parent object is going to form a union of observed states or observed positions of the child object, and that causes a behavior to be learned. And then we have to work out all these corner cases. Yeah, magic.
Yeah. Yeah, and then what you call it?
And
Yeah, so just
using that mechanism that we just described, which Vivian came up with, which is how the behavior model informs the child, how the child object should be viewed at this moment in time, based on the, and then that will then form new links to the parent object, saying, okay, yeah, it's like a virtuous circle, right? The parent
yeah.
detects emotion, it starts representing the emotion in a behavior. The behavior starts changing what's expected of the child. The child then forms new links to the, to the parent. And you keep doing that. And then at any point in time, if you see the parent, you can invoke a behavior. And if you see a behavior, you can predict what the parent will see and all these things. Something like that.
Yeah, and then I guess just for people to kind of maybe think about, you know, in the background or whatever. So one implication of this is, you know, when we work through kind of goal-directed behaviors and stuff, before we had state here in the morphology models. And so last week we started working through like how would these kinds of goal-directed behaviors like flipping on the switch work with the state only in the behavior models. And yeah, so that's something we still need to work out some details on. But that would be one of the more significant kind of changes, at least from
So
your
say that
existing
again.
mental model.
What's the change again? Right before we were
That the
associating.
morphology model had state, and so
But
it was part of the causal learning chain.
but I don't see why you still do that? Just call the state the you know, those unique features. You know,
Maybe,
those.
but I'm just saying it wouldn't look like this. Like we have to update this diagram.
Right. But in my mind, I'm doing this sort of mental switch. I'm saying instead of having a state variable at some level of the object,
Yeah.
we essentially have state representations at wherever we have those features that were detected during behaviors. They are the state variable.
Yeah, so you're saying the unique SDRs, like
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And which is really what you always want to do is you want to get to some SDR and say that SDR represents. So if I observe the switch in the up position, that is you know the thing I'm going to link to for causality.